would happen, or we'd run out of money. I snorted. Fat chance of that. Or get tired of fighting. Or we'd make a mistake. Ms. Benning turned to me. They've thrown everything but the kitchen sink at us. It's a good thing Mrs. Brodeur was wealthy. She sat back and sighed. Anyway, Mr. Johansson, they've used up all their ammunition, and we've used up all of ours. Today the judge will decide. Unless a miracle occurs for them, we will win. I looked over at Rosie, Leanne, and Howard. Howard looked ready to throw up. It seemed like a bit of an overreaction, since my impression through all of this had been that he was being dragged along by the girls. And speaking of, they didn't look nearly as nervous as would be indicated by Ms. Benning's confident remark. Perhaps their lawyer was stringing them along, but why? It wouldn't increase his billing, and anyway, he didn't look all that confident. Then Rosie turned and looked at me, and my heart froze. I don't think I'd ever seen the particular facial expression malicious triumph before, but trust me, it's one of those expressions you'll recognize the first time with 100% certainty. What was going on? She couldn't be expecting to win this case. And if not, with a sinking feeling of panic, I remembered Dr. Onagi's suspicions. I sent a text to Will, Bill, and Bob. One of them had to be free, and they were in the minority of Bobs that were guaranteed to not be traveling at relativistic speeds. I'll take care of it, came back a moment later from Bill. I breathed a sigh of relief, but my stomach refused to unknot. The judge came in. We did the all-rise thing, then sat. There was considerable noise from the surprisingly large number of spectators. Apparently this case had achieved significant notoriety. The judge banged his gavel several times and demanded quiet. Judge Katz spent a long time summarizing the facts and pleadings of the case. Even though I was deeply emotionally involved, I still found my mind wandering. I had to respect people like Ms. Benning who could sit through this regularly without their foreheads slamming onto the desk. Then finally, the judge came to the punchline.
I must, in the end, uphold the right of the decedent to decide her own destiny.
There were gasps and muttering around the courtroom. I half expected Rosie to stand up and start screaming invective, but no, she just took out her phone and texted something. And at that moment, I knew that Dr. Onagi had been right. We all filed out of the courtroom. Ms. Benning was shaking my hand, and her assistant was making a phone call, when Rosie strode up to me. You may think you've won, but you still won't steal our mother from us. Christ's sake, Rosie, are you still on that narrative? There is no stealing. There never was any stealing. Ignoring for the moment the fact that it was your mother's decision, you still have her. You still have the body to bury. You still have her memories. You lost nothing. Just the same. You won't get her. I've made sure of that. You mean sabotaging the stasis pod at the hospital? I raised my eyebrows in an expression of exaggerated inquiry, and she went white. I'm sorry, Rosie, but if you can defy a court order, so can I. Bill sent in a drone with the scanner and did the deed while we were in court, except that, unlike you, Bill would have respected the court's decision if we'd lost. Rosie took a step back and her lips formed into a silent snarl. I shook my head. Bill confirmed with me that a device embedded in the stasis pod damaged it and shut it down just around the time you sent a text. There will be an investigation, of course. I'm pretty sure sabotage of hospital equipment is a crime of some kind. I'm willing to throw myself on the mercy of the court for my transgression. I have a feeling it'll go worse for you. I gave Rosie a blank, cold look. I knew your mother and father. I loved and respected them both. Right now, I can't understand how you could be related to them. She opened her mouth to say something, and I turned and walked away. 38. Traveling. Herschel, September 2236, interstellar space. I'm serious, Herschel. It's not coming back up. Neil's voice took on a little bit of a whine when he got really frustrated. The sound set my teeth on edge. and it was one of the only times I didn't want to be around him. Have you jim-jammed the Framistan? Oh, funny guy, how about you hang up the comedy act for a second and give me a hand? And if you start clapping, I will busterize you. I chuckled and activated one of my inside drones. We kept a set of spares in Bay 446, which was about as central as you could get in the Bellerophon. The drone flew out the open bay doors into the ship's main axial corridor. 5 clicks of straight flight took less than a minute, then a right turn, and I was in the power room. Room was a funny word to use for an open area a quarter kilometer on a side, but we'd gotten used to thinking of the ship as normal-sized and ourselves as bugs. Neil had 3 drones and a dozen roamers swarming the power core's control area. For some reason, when Neil got frustrated, he made the roamers tap their feet. I've never asked if it was on purpose. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I've done everything, he exclaimed as soon as he saw my drone. It's dead. Inert. It works fine, he says. As dependable as one of our own, he says. Fine, Herschel, get it out of your system. Make fun. Then when you're done, maybe we can work on fixing this friggin' thing. I considered milking it for a few more moments, but why get greedy? As sure as entropy, I'd have another chance sooner or later. Neil, I can see from here that the anodes are saturated. You can do a bleed, which will take about an hour, or you can do a full restart in 20 minutes. Oh, God, no. I'll help, okay? We can't afford to be down like this all the time. I called up some more drones and roamers, and we started the long and finicky restart process. A bleed would take longer, but didn't require a lot of effort, so it was Neil's go-to response. Once we had the roamers and drones set up, I turned to Neil. Why don't you have an AMI set up to monitor this stuff? It's a freaking rote task, dude. I know, I keep meaning to. So you're doing things the hard way. Because you're too lazy to figure out how to do them the easy way? Neil, you are truly a putz. Neil grinned at me, unoffended. A lazy putz, thank you very much. Okay, Hirsch, point taken. I'll get on it. I smiled, leaned back, and stretched. Just another damned day at the office. The cargo vessels weren't just big empty barns. In some ways, that would have been convenient, but it would have required us to build something to anchor our various projects. I imagined the others went through some vaguely similar logic. The vessels were large cylinders, organized radially. A central corridor 100 meters in diameter stretched from the nose to the tail of the ship. A huge cargo door at either end allowed entry and egress. Storage bays were arranged internally in rings around the central corridor. 8 bays per ring by default, and each bay sported a massive double door. The AI controller and drive system were located in the middle ring, and the power core was at the rear of the craft. Neil and I spent many hours touring the inside of the Bellerophon, trying to figure out the reasoning behind some of the design choices. In particular, Neil didn't see why they needed bays at all. Look, Hirsch, we've got the video from Mario's discovery on Beta Hydri. The ingots they were producing weren't that big, like the size of a car. Why not just stack them in a big central area? You just answered your own question, Neil. You really want ingots the size of Chevys banging around inside a spaceship? Christ's sake, dude, they tie them down to what? Now you need stanchions of some kind, at least. You can't tie it down to one single connection point either, because that's a disaster waiting to happen. Besides, who says metal harvesting is the only thing they use these ships for? Good point. They do have power connections in every bay. That would make sense if they use them for other stuff, like maybe manufacturing areas. Yeah, I hesitated, and Neil looked over at me curious. Well, I have a theory based on this ship. Neil made a rolling motion with his hand for me to continue. Look, Neil, we do our manufacturing out in space because we don't give a crap and it's convenient. But given what we know of the others and the way they huddle in their death asteroids, well, what if they're an underground species? Maybe they're deeply agoraphobic. Maybe they do all their manufacturing inside one of these things because if they had to supervise something outside, it would scare the crap out of them. Neil bobbed his head back and forth. Not unreasonable. Total speculation, of course. Hey, you could always go ask them. He grinned at me.
Mover plates are offline.
The hell? We both looked up at Guppy. What happened? I asked.
Plate AMIs have lost synchronization.
Neil looked at me. 3rd time this month. About ready to concede yet? Crud. I rubbed the bridge of my nose. Okay, I give. Guppy, take them through restart. Let me know when the drive is up again. And we're going to make 8 more plates and try to even out the field. The problem wasn't really too few plates. Bill's calculations had been right. 24 plates would fly the Bellerophon, all things being equal. But all things were not equal. We had a couple of bobs, us, constantly flying around in the ship under our own surge fields, moving and shifting mass around in the ship, and restarting the power core a couple of times a month. We were our own worst enemy. We needed some wiggle room, in the form of a little extra field strength to absorb the glitches. I watched Neil do the I told you so dance for a few moments. When you're done being an ass, let's see where we can set this up. Maybe a free bay toward the front. Neil grunted. You know, there was a time when we were pond scum, and we just flew around a lot and minded our own business. Ah, the good old days, I replied. When things were simpler, kids were more respectful, and we had to walk to school through 6 feet of snow. Barefoot, uphill. Both ways. 39. Retirement. Marcus, February 2218. Poseidon. I sat in a lawn chair, soaking in the warm afternoon sun. I hardly ever thought about the fact that I was inhabiting an android anymore. Howard and Bob kept improving the model, and Bill seemed happy with the delegation of responsibility. Couldn't really blame him, I supposed. He had other things on his mind. Around me, children played, couples walked hand in hand, and people did their jobs either through tablets or telepresence. If this wasn't a utopia, I'd be damned if I could figure out what was missing. Especially for me. Rather than take back control of the auto factories after the revolution, I'd aggressively created the means for the population of Poseidon to take over the responsibility. Now, 3 years later, I had absolutely no duties in this system. As promised, Gina had voted me out on my ear. To her chagrin, she found herself voted in as chairperson. The new council was still arguing about what to put in as a permanent government, but that was certainly nothing new. I got up and walked along the path toward the nearest food kiosk. That particular lawn chair might or might not be occupied if I returned, but there'd be another. Or I could just park my butt on the grass. The problem I had run into was perhaps not totally unexpected. Bob had always been a driven, workaholic personality. Great for when you were defending the galaxy from the rampaging hordes, maybe not so good when you just arranged to have yourself made redundant. Poseidon's society had been fundamentally changed, and the change looked to be permanent. Fewer and fewer people were living on the mats, or even working on them for longer than necessary. The floating cities, the aquatic ones that is, were being converted entirely to industrial use. Humans were now an aerial species on this world. I grabbed a chocolate shake. Nothing had ever been invented or discovered that beat chocolate, and headed over to the edge of the city. Looking down through the dome, I could see wispy clouds, drifting mats, sparkling blue water right out to the horizon, and the occasional huge, shadowy silhouette gliding just under the surface. The krakens, hydra, and leviathans weren't the only large predators, or even the biggest. We kept discovering new beasties, often the hard way. There wasn't really a concerted effort yet to catalog everything under the surface, maybe because of the danger.
So, how's life as a retiree?
I turned to find Cal grinning at me. I'm pretty sure I had my location turned off. How'd you find me? Cal rolled his eyes.
Come on, Marcus. You're kind of famous. There've been 3 social media posts with your image in the last 15 minutes. If you want anonymity, you're going to have to modify that mug of yours.
I nodded and turned back to the dome wall. Or disappear entirely.
What's going on, Marcus?
Cal stepped closer, frowning. Oh, hey, that came out more dramatic than intended. I gave Cal an apologetic smile and waved at the view. I'm just thinking about a new career. Oceanography. Cal raised an eyebrow.
I think there's an opportunity here. You've seen videos of Garfield's pterosaur-like android. Bob 1 has definitely gone non-human. Why even stick to bipedal? Cal looked out at the ocean below. You mean, I wonder how an android dolphin would fare on this world. 40. Recovery. Bob, January 2225, Delta Iridini. I paused to stretch, then pulled a tent flap aside and peeked outside. Wow! Good day to stay indoors. The rain, in drops almost as big as marbles in this heavy atmosphere, came in more horizontally than otherwise. These tropical storms were surprisingly rare in this part of Eden, fortunately. I wondered how the Deltans would have handled them before my introduction of tents, probably huddled under blankets made from skins. I remembered that storm they'd endured during the exodus from the old village. That hadn't been as bad as this, but it had still put me onto the tent idea. I glanced around the village. No one was in sight, not surprisingly. Behind me, I heard stirring.
Are you going to keep that thing open forever? You're letting the cold in.
I grunted and released the flap. Belinda wasn't big on cold. I returned to my spot, lay down, and put my hands behind my head. Archimedes was awake, turning a piece of flint in his hands. I could see that it was the spearhead from Fred's spear. Archimedes looked in my direction.
I've got an idea for getting the flint teaching thing going.
He waved the spearhead like a wand.
It's worth it if it ends the fighting.
Sure, Archimedes. I've got your back, whatever you want to do.
Good. I'll have to make a half-dozen or so spearheads and knife blades first. Belinda won't let me work inside, so I hope this storm ends soon.
My bones tell me it'll clear up around noon. I twisted my ears in amusement, and Archimedes returned the expression. I had earned a reputation as an accurate forecaster of weather, crediting aches in my bones for being able to feel the change. In fact, I simply looked down from orbit at the prevailing weather patterns. Sure, it was cheating. So what? The storm blew itself out by early afternoon, so we headed out to Archimedes' favorite flint working spot. I was impressed by the amount of flint flakes lying discarded on the ground. Someone pushed them into a pile occasionally when they started to become an irritant, so there was an even larger heap of flakes a few feet away. Children would often pick through the pile, looking for flakes that could be made into arrowheads. Archimedes didn't mind. He made more than enough product to trade for everything he and his family could want. Archimedes endured a coughing fit as he sat down. He still hadn't completely recovered from the kidnapping. I waited, ready to go back for water if he needed it. Over the course of the afternoon, Archimedes roughed out a dozen blanks. I took the opportunity to go on a quick hunting trip, during which I checked surveillance for any carrion activity. I found nothing, which led me to hope that the incident had cooled any desire by the other village to take us on again. I dropped off a turkey equivalent with Belinda, received a smile in return, and returned to Archimedes' work area.
I'll be a few days getting these ready, Robert, he said to me as I sat down. Then we have to figure out how to offer them without getting killed.
Sooner the better, buddy. I'll talk to Donald. Archimedes resumed his work, and I settled back to enjoy the sunshine. 41. Resurrection. Howard, October 2220, HIP 14101. I reached out for the umpteenth time to flip the switch and pulled my hand back, yet again. Oh, my freaking God, what was wrong with me? I had Bridget's scan, finally, after months of court battles. I had a matrix and a ship built for her. Her VR was set up. Her firewall was set up. I had accounts set up for her on BobNet. What the hell? In desperation, I sent a text off to Bill. Am I doing the right thing? The answer came back almost immediately. Oh, hell no. Well, nothing like a little bit of support from your friends. Chuckling, I flipped the switch. Bridget appeared in the middle of my VR.
28 years old, thick red hair, dimples, lab coat, just like the first day I'd met her. I stared, slack-jawed. I couldn't help it. I was completely, utterly frozen. Bridget turned a full circle, then smiled uncertainly at me. "Howard?" I wordlessly got up, rushed to her, and wrapped her in my arms. She hugged me, put her head on my shoulder, and we simply existed for what could have been forever. Finally, she stepped back and looked at me searchingly. "I guess this means I'm dead." "Original Bridget is dead. You are very much alive." "Okay, Howard, I'll toe the official line. I know you've always been sensitive about the difference." "It's important to get an image of yourself as a unique person, Bridge. You aren't just a copy. You're you. And you'll become more you as time goes on." I took her hand and led her to the couch. I had copied the couch from her apartment in the hope that it would reassure her. She looked at it and chuckled, no doubt fully aware of my intent. "We've got hundreds of Bobs now. Every one of us is different. Some are a little different, some are a lot. There's no feeling of us just being Bob clones, and you aren't just a Bridget clone." Bridget's lips pressed together for a moment. Then she looked me in the eyes. "Got it. If I believe my Catholic upbringing, original Bridget is now in either heaven or hell. You know, the Catholic Church was never able to come up with a coherent policy on replicants, right?" I chuckled. They didn't have a whole lot of time before Armageddon distracted everyone. Bridget blew out a deep breath and looked around. "What happened to the beach?" "I can bring that back if you want, but this is my normal indoor VR. I've kind of settled on the default Bob library/living room." "Could we, please? I never actually experienced the ocean shore in real life on Earth." I nodded, and the VR changed to my tropical paradise. A warm breeze ruffled our clothing, gulls squawked in the distance, and Jeeves stood at attention with a couple of drinks with little umbrellas. Bridget giggled. She looked around, sighed, then patted the couch. "This could probably go." "Your wish is my command." The couch was replaced with a couple of comfortable lawn chairs, not the plasticky ones with crossways straps, but the good ones, with a fitted cushion. No geese here to worry about. Bridget lay back in the chair and took a deep breath. "Okay, this is not bad. I might still have a panic attack at some point, but then maybe not. So, let's bring me up to date. I died?" "Yes." I hesitated, looking at her. "Heart failure. You hadn't told me that you'd changed your will. Apparently it was a surprise to a lot of people." She looked at me intently. "How did it go over with the children?" I rolled my eyes. "Good thing you set aside that defense fund. I've got all the court documents and such still. You can look them over whenever you want. Suffice it to say, though, that we are no longer on speaking terms." Bridget looked down with an expression of deep sadness. "I guess I'm probably not going to be their favorite person, either. Nevertheless, I should make the attempt. Start with Howie." She nodded thoughtfully, then looked around. So what do I do?" "Oh, boy. I guess we should start with lessons. Replicant VR 101. I received a text from Bridget indicating that she was finished with her phone calls. I popped into her VR right away to find her sitting on her couch and quietly crying. I sat down beside her and, without saying a word, took her hand. She took a few more milliseconds, then smiled at me through the tears. "I have to admit, I love that you didn't include running noses in the VR world." "Look, there's a limit to even our obsessive realism." I grinned at her. "We also don't have mosquitoes. That by itself is worth the price of admission." I lost the grin and looked into her eyes. "So, want to talk about it?" Bridget sighed and sat back into the couch. I noted in passing that it was the same couch as she'd had in her real apartment, the one I'd used when I brought her back. The VR was, in fact, a mostly faithful copy of her former home, except for the addition of a bigger sitting room area and a bay window with a sun-filled view of the Vulcan landscape. "I talked to Howie," she said. Her lip quivered for a moment. "He was distant, but seemed embarrassed about it. I think he's caught between a rock and a hard place, wanting to accept me, but knowing that Rosie would never forgive him." I said, I figured that would be safe. Bridget smiled sadly. Rosie was always difficult. She knows what she wants, and isn't interested in differing opinions, or concerned about damage from trying to get her way. Be patient, Bridge. Howie will come around. Out of curiosity, if nothing else. I can put him onto my relatives as well. Give him a more positive viewpoint on replicants as family. Bridget nodded and wiped her eyes. Then she looked at her hands with a quizzical expression. I suppose I could really just alter the VR to clean myself up, couldn't I? Yes, but don't. If you start getting in the habit of shortcutting things, you end up just floating around the room like Dracula. The VR helps us remain grounded. I stopped and thought for a second. Although now, with the androids and all, it might not be as important. Bridget stood up. She wandered slowly around her VR, occasionally picking up objects and examining them. She ended up at the bay window, looking out at the Vulcan forest in the distance. The sun was setting, and long shadows stretched across the foreground. She gazed out at the landscape for a few moments, then raised a hand and made a small gesture. The Vulcan landscape changed into an aerial view of the Odin cloudscape. Blimps floated in the distance, moving in small groups. That's from the videos I took, I said, pleased. I walked over to stand beside her. Bridget turned to me and returned my smile. Please don't be insulted, Howard. But it was the chance to study the Odin life forms that turned me around on the replication question. Ha ha, I replied. My evil plan is working like a ow! Just remember, you can still feel my wrath, wise guy. She grinned as I rubbed my shoulder. Now, can we see about a field trip? Yes, precious. Just don't hurt us again. Oh, Howard. Well, I'd wanted a family. 42. Results negative. Bill, February 22-28, 82 Aridny. I'd received a report from Mac, so I popped into his VR to discuss it. Hey, Bill, pull up a rock. Mac waved a hand at a very comfortable-looking, overstuffed easy chair, and I took the invitation. I read your report, Mac. Not very encouraging. You mean the Medeiros part? Yeah. We've scanned this entire system right out to the Oort. Nada. In fact, I did a second scan, staggered in relation to the first one, in case something was hiding in a weak scan zone or something. Still nada. What are the chances that what we saw with Medeiros was all there was? I doubted that myself, but wanted confirmation that my thinking was reasonable. Can't see it, Bill. Those busters and those missiles had to come from somewhere. You saw that I talked it over with Calvin, right? No damned way, were his exact words. Nor could he have hauled all those busters, missiles, and roamers all the way from Alpha Centauri. I stared into space, considering. Mind you, he couldn't have brought them in from a nearby system either. At least not in one trip. Mac nodded and rubbed his chin. So, either he took 2 trips, or he had help. Or he's building them locally. Maybe you need to go out farther on the scan. Or, Bill, something I've been thinking about. We use the cloaking for busters and bombs, and that's basically what Medeiros has been using it for. But what if he got the bright idea of cloaking an entire auto factory? I could feel my eyebrows going up. Oh, that would be bad. Then he could be in this system, and we'd have to hit him with a focused pulse to even have a hope of detecting him. Max sighed and sat back in his chair. He looked up at the ceiling, not speaking, for almost a half second. On the other hand, I could be invoking imaginary dangers here. We are completely in the dark on this one. You're up to strength now, right? More or less. Mac waved a hand dismissively. We've got printers, we've got resources, I'm building a new cohort, I have busters to spare, but it looks like I'm going to have to mobilize a system-wide defense. There's a lot of that going around these days, Mac. Look, once you have your cohort up and running, start on more surveillance drones. Give them both long-range and focused scanning capability. I know the chance of hitting something at random with a focused scan is low, but it's not zero. Mac nodded. I stood, gave him a wave, and popped out. Between the others and Medeiros, life was just way too interesting. 43. Course correction. Icarus, March 2240, interstellar space. I am coming up on Epsilon Indy Day. From here, it's a quarter circle. How's your flight path? Daedalus's response came immediately. Checking. I waited for what seemed forever, but was probably a few milliseconds. This was the critical point in our approach. From this point on, we'd each describe a nice, smooth arc terminating at GL 877. But timing became increasingly critical now. I'm right on the money, buddy. Tau is correct. Everything's in the green. Excellent, I responded. Let's go kick some others' butt. 44. Debut. Howard. December 2220. Odin. We flew effortlessly through the Odin skies, our wings beating just fast enough to maintain momentum. The manta android bodies seemed to be fooling the local wildlife. Prey animals bolted, larger animals circled their young or simply ignored us. Ahead, a flock of blimps moved lazily through a krill field, grazing. They'll keep an eye on us, but shouldn't otherwise alter their behavior, as long as we don't start chasing the juveniles, Bridget messaged to me. Got it. Observe, but don't snack. Ha ha, funny man. In typical engineering fashion, I'd been content to build drones and observe from afar. Bridget, the moment she'd heard about Bob's Charlie android that emulated a Delton and Marcus's experiments with aquatic versions, had suggested we try something similar. The mantas were a mid-level pack predator, shaped generally like the eponymous earthfish. As with all Odin life, they contained a hydrogen sac to maintain neutral buoyancy. I had wanted to use helium instead for the androids, but the heavier construction created enough issues without using the less buoyant alternative. We caught up to the flock of blimps. These were the huge animals that I'd spotted on my first deep dive into Odin's atmosphere. They filled a niche similar to baleen whales, feeding on the plentiful small life that seemed to fill the air. We began to circle them, and each blimp kept a huge eye on a stalk pointed our way. Are you recording? Yes, dear. Her response was a LOL and a heart emoji.
Reminder, moot starts soon.
Whoops. I messaged Bridget, and she reluctantly agreed to pack it in for the day. We set our androids to autonomous station keeping. They would fly a slow, large circle, avoiding contact with other animals until we needed them again. We popped back into my VR. As usual after a manta session, Bridget's face was flushed and she wore an ecstatic expression. Are you sure you're up for this? We can still put it off. Bridget lost her smile. I know, Howard, but I feel like I'm starting to become phobic about it. I have to come out in public sooner or later. All right, take a deep breath. I took her hand, smiled reassuringly, I hoped, and we popped into the moot VR. It could have passed for a photograph instead of a live-action scene. Almost 100 versions of my face stared back at us, eyes wide, mouths in the identical O shape. No movement, no sound. Even the Jeeveses had stopped to stare. The tableau held for a couple of milliseconds. Then I leaned close to Bridget and stage whispered, Don't worry. They're more scared of you than you are of them. Just don't make eye contact. The room broke up in laughter, and Bobs began coming over to say hi. It was starting to look like we'd be mobbed. Well, Bridget would be mobbed. I might as well have been lint. But I'd carefully timed our entrance. At that moment, Bill gave the blat from his air horn that meant the meeting was starting. Bobs turned to face Bill, and Bridget exhaled a sigh of relief. We maneuvered ourselves to the back to get a couple of beers and watch the moot without being too much of a distraction. A short, trim man with thick dark hair walked over and said hello in an Australian accent. I nodded to him and turned to Bridget. Bridget, this is Henry Roberts. He's from the Australian probe that Linus found in Epsilon Indy. Henry? Bridget. Bridget made a small show of looking around and said, Henry, I only see the one of you. Are you not replicating? Henry shook his head emphatically. No way, ma'am. Since Linus rebuilt my matrix, I don't feel any need for more of me, nor to explore the universe particularly. Hasn't really gone that well for the Bobs so far. Come on, Henry. Just the one creepy, marauding alien species? That's pretty good, overall. I smiled at him. Henry smirked back, then turned to Bridget. What about you? Planning to replicate? Bridget rolled her eyes. I understand why that was the original plan with the Heaven Project, but the whole concept just gives me the shakes. She looked at me for a moment. I don't understand how the Bobs are comfortable with it. It may be related to original Bob's humanistic philosophy. I cut in. You're probably right about the humanism, but to say we're comfortable with it is a slight exaggeration. If not for the others and the issue with Earth, I bet there'd be only a few dozen of us. Both Bridget and Henry nodded thoughtfully. Henry replied, And since you have that covered, I guess we're good. I haven't felt any pressure to contribute copies. We're resource-constrained, Henry. We can only build so many ships per year. Whether they're Bob's or Henry's or Bridget's, doesn't matter. Might as well stick with the current system. At least the new clones come out knowing the full story. Bridget smiled at me before turning back to Henry. So what are you going to do with yourself to keep busy? Henry looked surprised for a moment, then grinned. To tell the truth, Bridget, I'm on my way to Omicron Squared Eridne right now. I'm going to get an android body made, land on Romulus or Vulcan, and build a sailboat. Then I'll spend a decade or two sailing the whole planet. In fact, he added after a moment's thought, I think I'll try to sail every ocean of every planet in the human sphere. Chances are I'll never catch up. I laughed and nodded my head in Bridget's direction. And she is going to catalog every species on every planet in the human sphere. Damn betcha. What's it to you? Bridget glared at me in challenge. Henry chuckled. Well then, I expect I'll run into you from time to time. Bridget responded with her nuclear-powered laugh, and Henry's eyes widened slightly. Yeah, she affects people like that. I'd made sure to preserve Bridget's mannerisms as faithfully as possible. Henry's reaction showed that the laugh was as effective in VR as it had been in real life. I frowned for a moment. She didn't laugh as much as she used to, though. I wondered if that was because of replicant variations or her recent experiences. Have you used one of the human androids yet? Henry was making a visible effort to get himself back on an even keel. Bridget shook her head and looked at me. Howard's been trying to get me to try it. I think I'm just going to take it slow. And I'm worried about running into my children. But she's okay flying an alien predator around on a gas giant. I winked at her and she grinned back. Henry chuckled, then turned to face the front as Bill finished his opening speech. First item on the agenda was always the others. Preparation for and status of. No one wanted to miss anything. Bill's summary was short and to the point. The harvesting of Delta Pavonis continued. The Bobs still didn't have any way of stopping it, and no one had a plan. Outstanding. 45. PAV arrival. Jacques, May 2247, HIP 84051. I settled into an orbit around HIP 84051-2. It was a young planet of a young star, according to the survey. Native plant life hadn't reached the angiosperm stage, and animal life hadn't figured out endothermia yet. I hoped that Phineas and Ferb had managed to pick up a lot of genetic samples on PAV before the others arrived. According to updates from Bill over the last few decades, recreating plants and animals from samples was getting a lot easier. Of course, that comment was based on Earth life, with which we were very familiar. Extraterrestrial stuff would take some more work. Mind you, we didn't have to decant the PAV right away. Life forms didn't suffer degradation in a stasis pod. We could take our time, figure out the PAV biology, get the process working, then wake up the refugees. I'd like that. I checked the notes on HIP 84051. The Bob that explored and reported this system was named Steve. There was no indication where his name came from. Maybe Steve Dallas from Bloom County? As good a guess as any. It wasn't worth pinging him just to ask, even assuming he was connected to BobNet at the moment. I spent a month going over his notes while I waited for Phineas and Ferb to arrive. Steve went into considerable detail about climate, ecology, geology, and such. He seemed to be a bit of a keener. Despite the fact that I was in a new star system, I found myself just going through the motions. I had no energy, no enthusiasm. It took me a while to realize what was wrong. I finally figured out that there was no joy here. This wasn't expansion. This wasn't a new colony, whether for humans or, in this case, Pav. This was being chased out. This was fleeing from a home that had been perfectly suited to them, to take refuge somewhere else that was nothing more than the best alternative available. The thought was dangerously depressing. I had to get out of this funk or I'd be no good to anyone. I waited until the colony ships were close enough, then popped in to visit. Hi, Phineas. Hello, Jacques. Pull up a chair. Survey okay? I settled into an overstuffed easy chair. No surprises. Not the greatest. Kind of a Devonian level of ecosystem. They can live there. Right? Phineas looked at me searchingly. You've got a bit of the Dickie Downer thing going, I think. I laughed. Guilty as charged. There's nothing about this whole situation that doesn't suck donkey balls. I guess it's just gotten to me. Well, I have been following Bill's blog on somatic regeneration from genetic material. Wow, that's really good, Phineas. I could hear the capitals. Nyuk, nyuk. Anyway, Ferb and I batted it back and forth during the voyage, and we took a look at the samples we have in stasis, and we think we could get Bill's techniques to work on Pav biology. Huh. Okay. So we hold off on decanting them for a while so you can try out your ideas? I think so. The delay won't harm them, and I'd like to hand them something a little better than this raw planet. I nodded. Good. Let's do that. I already felt better. 46. City. Howard, June 2221, Odin. Bridget found me lounging in my office, feet up on my desk, gazing abstractedly at a hologram floating in the air. What's that? She pointed at the image. You know how Marcus created those flying cities on Poseidon? Mm-hmm, Bridget replied. And a thorough shitstorm along with them. I read blogs too. I grinned at her. Well, it got me thinking. Odin is this huge freaking planet, and if you're going to go all floating city, why not here? Okay. Is that his design? No, I gestured at the hologram. I don't need surge coils to stay afloat. Turns out normal earth pressure air in an enclosed bubble will float in Odin's atmosphere at the 1.5 bars level. I've designed the city within a prolate spheroid, which will be very stable and more than strong enough with carbon fiber reinforced materials. Sure, but who's going to live there? Well, I was thinking maybe us. Bridget raised an eyebrow at me. Howard, are you forgetting what VR stands for? No, dear. I grinned at her as she stuck her tongue out. I'm thinking android bodies. Our very own city in the clouds. Don't say I never give you anything. You, sir, have far too much time on your hands. I nodded, then lost my smile. Seriously, though, Bridget, this whole thing with the others, it's not out of the question that we might end up having to hide human colonies in gas giants to avoid getting wiped out. The Bobs are really concerned about this species, aren't they? Bridget's eyes showed her concern. Yeah, Bridge. Delta Pavonis really kicked the stuffing out of us. I feel kind of bad that I'm not more involved in the war effort. I guess this is my contribution. So, we'd be the beta testers. Bridget sat down at my desk and examined the model more closely. Yep, and of course, we can't really be hurt if things go bad. Bridget poked a finger at the model and turned it this way and that. She examined it in silence for several milliseconds. Then she turned to me. And a front row seat to watch Odin life in action. Okay, Howard. You've been wanting to get me involved in a printing project. Let's see what we can do. 47. Foreboding. Riker, December 2240. Sol. Bill stared into space, slowly twirling the glass of whiskey in his hand. I'd Mackie 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 in his